We talk a lot about thumbnails here at Little Monster. I have more than once called them the most important part of your video, maybe even including the video itself. Unfortunately, thumbnails are also really tough. Honestly, I'm not a great graphic designer, and putting together thumbnails myself is a real challenge. Like, sure, I can help explain best practices to people, but doing it physically is really tough. But spending time fiddling with the graphics and seeing how everything fits together and how to work it into a template is really helpful for understanding thumbnails. So even if working on it hasn't made me a great graphic designer, it has made me a lot better at looking at where to experiment with thumbnails. And experimentation is really important because sure, best practices are a great starting place, but every single audience is different, and some best practices aren't going to apply to you in the same way that they apply to somebody else. Testing the right variables in the right way can save you a lot of time and headache in the long run. Now, when it comes to raw experimentation, the best thing to do is to take one thumbnail and change one thing about it, and then switch between the two in an A/B test. This is a tool that some levels of TubeBuddy provide, and it's something that YouTube has talked about providing in the future, but right now they're too busy getting rid of things like community captions. Gotta go ahead and just check that off my to-do list, is dunking on the hand that feeds me. Experimentation with an A/B test is the best way to get reliable, consistent results. If you A/B test changes consistently, it's going to help you create a strong template over time. If you don't have that level of TubeBuddy, you can do this manually, but it is a tremendous pain. You are going to have to switch thumbnails and track stats every single day, and you can't miss it once, and it's a real pain. And then you're gonna have to go and analyze the whole thing to make sure the results are actually statistically significant. A more lo-fi way that you can experiment is just to slowly change your thumbnails over time. Try some things that you hadn't before and see if the results are meaningfully different. This is far less scientific because you're changing many more things. The video content is different, the value proposition is different. Those can affect performance too. But it's also really simple to do and free, which is a big advantage. Whatever method you use to test, the best results come if you only change one kind of thing at a time. This is going to tell you what actually makes a difference and what doesn't. If you test a bunch of things all together and you get significantly different results, you don't know what caused it. And if you don't get significantly different results, it could be that two things offset each other. So as we go through this list, please keep in mind that when you're testing, try to test just one of these things. So with that out of the way, here are 12 different things that you can experiment on in your next thumbnail. Number 1, the position of your primary element. Something's always going to be the most important element of your video. Where should you put it? Because it's prominent, it's usually very big, so it usually comes down to one of 3 places. You can be on the left, you can be on the right, or you can be in the center. Generally speaking, I go for putting the primary element on the left side of the screen. Our content's usually most often viewed in the United States, and English is read left to right. Your eyes are trained to go in that direction, so put the most important thing where people are most likely to put their eyes first. But that's not always the case. Maybe you can draw more focus by having something totally centered and other elements around it. Maybe putting your elements on the right side helps break up the monotony. Like if everyone in the suggested bar has put their primary element on the left side and you put yours on the right, it might help it stand out a little bit. Whatever you do though, don't put anything way down in the bottom right corner because the view length indicator is going to cover it up. You're going to lose it. Don't put text there, no one can read it. Don't put part of a facial expression down there, no one's gonna see it. Number 2, color schemes. You can experiment both in a general sense of should you go brighter, should you go darker, should you have higher saturation or lower saturation, or it can be about specific color palettes. So should I use more red? Should I use more blue? Should I use more green? If you have a specific brand identity, you might be a little bit limited here. Conventional wisdom says that we want bright colors and generally high saturation. There's also a prevailing theory that yellow activates more cones in your eyes and therefore draws your attention more easily. I don't know if that's actually been proven, but it does get thrown around a lot like it's true. And yellow is a very bright, eye-catching color. So maybe there's something to it. But again, you might have an audience that appreciates a different palette. Changing the kind of colors that you use is a pretty simple change, but it can have a pretty big impact. Number 3, fonts. If you just kind of use whatever font comes up, it might be worth experimenting and playing around with. If you have a specific font that you use, but it's really fancy or it's a serif font, you might want to consider experimenting with that too. Generally speaking, we don't want a lot of text on thumbnails overall, but what we want it to be extremely readable. Typically, this means sans serif in all caps. If that's not something you're doing, you might want to try experimenting with it. If you are doing it, but you're not happy with the font, consider looking for one that gives you a more distinctive identity. If you look hard, you might find a font that better communicates what your channel is going for. Number 4, Backgrounds. This is partially related to color, but what's happening behind your main element? Is it a picture? Is it an accurate representation of where you were when you were taking a selfie? Have you isolated a person and you've put them on a completely different background? Or in a different photo? Maybe you're not using an image at all. Maybe you have a gradient behind you. Or a solid color. What's the general expectation on your kind of content? You might have noticed that we used to use darker backgrounds. The darker backgrounds were a literal interpretation of where we're doing these videos because it was literally just this back wall. But when we use the brighter, lighter colored backgrounds, it gives off a more YouTube sense. Like, YouTube's color scheme is white. If we're talking about YouTube, perhaps it makes sense to more closely match that visual identity. As far as I know, that's an ongoing experiment. We don't actually have conclusive data on whether or not that works yet, but it's something that we're trying. Using a solid color background or a gradient makes it way less busy, but it can also get too sterile. So if you like everything that's going on in the foreground of your thumbnails, maybe try looking at what's going on behind those elements. Number 5, arrows and circles. You've seen this a lot, and you've seen it in a lot of places. If somebody's got a UFO video, they've got a yellow arrow pointing to it or a red circle identifying it in the blue sky. It's used in a lot more places than like conspiracy Bigfoot type videos, but that's a good place to find examples of it. It's a really interesting technique because it takes visual elements that typically would be very bad on a thumbnail because they're zoomed out and they're out of focus, but by creating a bright contrasting color that points to it, it draws our attention in. It makes us want to look at this tiny, tiny detail. And then when we're looking in at this pinprick, we're like, what's going on? So that makes you want to read the title and go, oh, this is what it's about. Maybe I want to watch that now. Or maybe I don't, but the first step to getting somebody to click on your video is getting them to look at your video in the first place. Arrows and circles have shown that they're a really great way to draw attention to minute details on a small image. And these are thumbnail images. They're going to be small. Getting somebody to look closely at them is a huge deal. Number 6, structures and subdivisions. Normally, thumbnails are a contiguous image. We don't have a lot of space to work with. Why would we want to cut it up more? But depending on your type of content, if you haven't tried it before, this can be super compelling. Dividing your thumbnail up into, say, 2 different images can give you a sense of progression. With 2 simple words and a vertical split down the middle, you get the prototypical before and after shot. And if you're already doing that, again, callback, you can use an arrow to imply additional causal relationship. Can you tell the difference between this bowl of candy and this bowl of candy made by Gordon Ramsay? Maybe, maybe not, but it's a really compelling image and it tells you what you're getting into. So if it's the kind of video you want to, it explains everything it needs to really quickly. Number 7, text amount. Generally, we're not a huge fan of putting a lot of text on thumbnails. You can get maybe one simple sentence with like one dependent clause if you're really stretching it. But depending on the amount of text you're using, you can play around with it. Sometimes adding a little bit of text can add a ton of flavor. One of my favorite uses of text is on a video about a Paralympic scandal. It has 3 words. They weren't disabled. It tells you the big deal with the video, and if you just read that sentence out of context, it already prompts questions. Who wasn't disabled? You make it sound like it's a bad thing that they weren't disabled. Why would that be a bad thing? And then you read the title and you're like, oh my God, because it's the Paralympics. And then if you haven't watched the story, you probably want to watch that story. If you're not using text at all and you're not a kids channel, you might try throwing in a few words. If you're using a bunch of words, you might try throwing a few away. And if you've never tried it, maybe try and do one thumbnail completely without text. See if you can get your images to stand on their own merits. Not every kind of content wants to do that, but if you can pull it off, it's really powerful. One of my favorite thumbnails of all time has no text and it is just a yellow rectangle. The video's title is "This Is Not Yellow." It is such a good combination, it makes me very angry. Number 8, text type. So we've talked about fonts, which are how we visually represent text, and we've talked about text length and how brief we want to be, but the actual content of the text is also something we can play around with. If we're being really broad and reductive, we can kind of divide up text into 3 separate categories. We can provide the value proposition straight up. This is just being very blunt about what your video is and isn't, and saying it right in the thumbnail. Teasing text also gets at what's in the video, but it leaves a little bit of a mystery. It's playing a little bit coy. This is more title text, but to give an idea of what a tease is, it would be something like, I brought 50 puppies home and this is what happened. You know what you're getting into, you know it's gonna be about puppies, you just don't know exactly what's going to happen. And the text is designed to get you curious about what's going to happen. We can also ask a question. Questions create an innate information gap. I know something that you don't. And putting it on my thumbnail implies that I'm going to give you the answer. So if it's a question that's interesting or valuable to you, it makes you more interested in clicking on it. Generally speaking, we find that text is most interesting when it's a little bit different than the title. So if the title is asking a question, maybe you want to tease in the thumbnail, or vice versa. But if you haven't spent time thinking about it, it's a good thing to experiment with. Number 9, Faces. We are naturally drawn to the human face because we are social creatures. We have evolved to seek out and read other faces, which is why you see them so often in thumbnails. They draw your eye in, and the hope is that you'll look long enough to get a sense of what the video is, and then if it's something you're interested in, you'll click on it. We're also drawn to really expressive emotions for the same evolutionary reasons. If you meet a stranger out in the savannah, it's really helpful to know if they're friendly or not off the bat. So something you can play around with is making different kinds of faces. You can be shocked. You can be angry. And you can play around with the difference between subtle and super expressive emotions. Super expressive emotions tend to draw the eye more, but depending on your kind of content, they can start to feel a little bit artificial. If you haven't taken super expressive pictures before, here's a little advice I've learned. I don't think my physique is bad. Solid 6 out of 10. But when I try and make really expressive faces, for some reason I lean my neck back and it creates this super weird double chin that looks very odd when you zoom in on just the face. Way to counteract that, just stick your head forward. So instead of doing shocked, do shocked. Like, it's not something to care about from a body positivity standpoint, but like it looks really weird because usually you're cutting it off at the face, so you have the face and then you just have a little extra bump. If you've run into that problem before, that's my tip to you. Number 10, number of primary elements. Usually when you're creating a video, you want to stick to a few things to really focus your attention on. These are going to be the biggest things in your thumbnail. Like we've said, they're usually faces. But the number isn't entirely set in stone. Generally speaking, I'm not surprised if the ideal number of elements is anywhere between 1 and 3. If you haven't played around with that space, consider giving it a shot. As a side note, sometimes more primary elements work if you have like an ensemble cast that's really color coordinated. So if I have something like Power Rangers, I might be able to put all the Power Rangers on screen because when they're all together, it creates this rainbow spectrum. Generally speaking, we find that experimenting within 1 to 3 is a better use of your time though. Number 11, focus and blur. As a general rule, we like our pictures to be clear, and thumbnails are not a huge canvas to work with, and blurring space can be kind of counterintuitive. Like you have what, like a square inch to work with? Like removing 30% of that is a really big deal. But if you really want to focus on a certain part of your image and you don't want to use something like a circle or an arrow to just point to it, blurring the rest of the image can be really helpful. You still put the object of focus in a real space, but you help draw the eye to it. You can see this in our thumbnails. We want to give the sense that I'm in a place, but the place itself is not important, so we blur the background a little bit. And finally, number 12, zoom level. Most of the time we talk about thumbnails with the implication that you're going to have things really close because, again, it's really small. This is a pretty accurate representation of thumbnail distance. It's very close. And being close typically isn't a bad thing, but it's not always the best thing. Let's say that I had narrative content that's a bit moody and somber. Having people up close and in your face doesn't really communicate the tone of what we're doing. So even though it doesn't typically follow best practices, depending on your content, you might want to try actually pulling the image back out a little bit. And if you have had your shots pulled way back out and you haven't tried zooming in before, do try zooming in. Size is always going to be one of the best ways to emphasize the important parts of your image. And that is 12 ways that you can experiment with your very next thumbnail. If you have a working proficiency of Photoshop, these are relatively easy to implement. If you don't have Photoshop or don't work in Photoshop, you can actually do a fair bit of this in something like PowerPoint. It's just a little bit harder and jankier because the software isn't meant for it. So if you'd like to try sprucing up your thumbnails, but you're not sure where to start, take one of these things, play around with it, run some tests, and see what happens. With enough testing, you'll be well on your way to crafting really good, really eye-catching thumbnails. And with that, thank you so much for clicking on this video. We worked really hard on the thumbnail. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out our other great videos on audience development. If you like this video, click the like button to let us know that you liked it and want to see more like it. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Little Monster for more videos on audience development every single week. See you next time. The last time I recorded a video late at night, I ended up saving someone's life that night. That sounds made up. It's entirely true. It was the weirdest thing that has happened to me this year, and there is a global pandemic this year. I've saved more lives not as a lifeguard than as a lifeguard, which is kind of f***ed up.